The candle in the hallway flickered as Elena Whitmore pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would give her away. Through the half-open door of the study, she heard the voice of Duke Alexander Ashworth, sharp and impatient, speaking to his mother. "She is a weight I never asked to carry, Mother. A distant cousin, with no place of her own. And now she lives under my roof, eating my bread, and sewing my linens, as if that makes her family. I did not choose this. You did." Elena's hands trembled around the small basket of thread she had been carrying to the sitting room. She had walked this corridor 100 times without a second thought. But tonight, the floor felt like it might open beneath her feet and swallow her whole. She had always known she was not truly one of them. She had always known the Duke barely looked at her during meals, that his replies to her were short, that his eyes moved past her as though she were another piece of furniture in the grand house. But hearing the word wait spoken about her, in his own voice, without hesitation, without softness, cut deeper than she thought possible. The Dowager Duchess Margaret answered gently, her voice trying to smooth the sharp edges of her son's words. "Alexander, she has nowhere else to go. Her father died in debt, and her mother followed him to the grave within the year. Would you truly have me turn away a girl of 19, with no family and no fortune?" "I am not asking you to turn her away," Alexander said, his tone clipped, cold, final. "I am simply saying I did not ask for this responsibility, and I grow tired of pretending that I did." Elena did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly down the corridor, her slippers silent against the polished floor, until she reached the narrow servant's staircase that led to her small room at the top of the house. She shut the door behind her and stood in the darkness, breathing hard, feeling the sting of tears she refused to let fall. She had spent 2 years in this house, believing that perhaps, in time, she might earn a small corner of belonging. She had mended shirts long after midnight, when the housekeeper was short of hands. She had sat with the Dowager Duchess through long evenings of illness, reading aloud until her voice grew hoarse. She had asked for nothing beyond a roof and a place at the table, and even that, it seemed, had been too much to ask. She lit the single candle on her dresser and looked at her reflection in the small, spotted mirror. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks pale. She did not recognize the girl staring back at her, a girl who had once dreamed of a life with laughter in it, now standing in a cold room, feeling like an unwanted guest in a house she had called home. There was a soft knock at the door. Elena quickly wiped her face and opened it to find Grace, one of the younger maids, standing with a worried expression. "I heard raised voices," Grace whispered. "Are you well, Miss Elena?" Elena forced a small smile. "I am tired, that is all. Thank you for checking on me, Grace." Grace lingered a moment, clearly unconvinced, but she did not press further. She wished Elena a good night and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Elena alone once more with her thoughts, which now moved with a speed and clarity she had not expected. She would leave, not in anger, not in a fit of emotion that she might regret in the morning, but with quiet determination. She would not stay in a house where she was tolerated rather than wanted. She had 2 years of savings from small sewing commissions she had taken in secret, enough, she hoped, to find modest lodging in London until she could build something of her own. She was skilled with a needle, more skilled than most seamstresses in the county, if she allowed herself even a small measure of pride. She could make a living. She had to believe that. Elena did not sleep that night. Instead, she packed her few belongings into a single traveling case, folding her dresses carefully, wrapping her sewing tools in cloth, and tucking away the small locket that had belonged to her mother, the only piece of jewelry she owned. She wrote a short note, leaving it on her neatly made bed, thanking the Dowager Duchess for her kindness, and wishing the household well, careful to make no mention of what she had overheard. She would not give the Duke the satisfaction of knowing his words had wounded her so deeply. She would simply disappear from his life, as quietly as she had entered it. Before the first light of dawn touched the windows, Elena crept down the servants' staircase, her case in hand, her heart hammering with both fear and a strange, fragile hope. She passed through the kitchen, where the ovens were not yet lit, and slipped out through the side door, into the cool morning air. The estate grounds stretched before her, silver with dew, the great house behind her rising like a dark shadow against the graying sky. She walked the long lane toward the village, her breath visible in small clouds before her, her case growing heavier with every step. She did not look back. She could not allow herself to look back, for she feared that if she did, she might lose her courage entirely and turn around, back into the house, back into the role of the tolerated guest, the burden, the weight someone had been forced to carry. At the village, she found the early morning coach that traveled toward London, run by a kindly old driver named Arthur, who asked no questions beyond her destination and the fare. She settled into her seat, her case clutched on her lap, and watched through the window as the fields and hedgerows blurred past, carrying her further and further from the only home she had known since her parents' passing. As the coach rattled along the uneven road, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since she had overheard those words, to weep. Not loudly, not in a way that would draw the attention of the other passengers, but quietly, her tears falling onto her gloved hands as she stared out at the passing countryside. She wept for the home she was leaving, for the family she had lost, for the girl who had once believed that kindness and hard work were enough to earn a place in the world. She wept because somewhere deep inside her, despite everything, a small and foolish part of her heart had hoped that the Duke, in time, might come to see her as something more than an obligation. But hope, she told herself firmly, wiping her eyes, was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had herself, her skill with a needle, and whatever future she could build with her own two hands, that would have to be enough. The coach rolled onward through small towns and quiet villages, the sun rising higher and casting long shadows across the road. Elena watched other passengers board and disembark, ordinary people going about ordinary lives, farmers and merchants, and a young mother with a sleeping child in her arms. She found a strange comfort in their presence, in the reminder that the world was vast and full of people who owed her nothing and expected nothing from her in return. By late afternoon, the coach reached the outskirts of London, and Elena felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of excitement and dread. She had visited the city only once before, as a child with her parents, and the memory was faint, more feeling than fact. Now she would have to navigate its crowded streets alone, find lodging, find work, and somehow carve out a life where none had been offered to her. She stepped down from the coach into the bustling noise of the city, carriages rattling over cobblestones, vendors calling out their wares, the air thick with smoke, and the smell of the river. She clutched her case tightly and asked a passing woman for directions to an affordable inn, and was pointed toward a modest establishment several streets away, run by a woman named Charlotte Hale. The inn was small but clean, its front door painted a cheerful shade of blue that seemed almost out of place among the gray stone buildings surrounding it. Elena knocked, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman in her middle years, her apron dusted with flour, her expression warm, despite the evident exhaustion of a long day's work. "Are you in need of a room, dear?" Charlotte asked, taking in Elena's traveling case and weary expression. "Yes, please," Elena said. "I have some savings, and I hope to find work soon." Charlotte studied her for a moment, then stepped back to allow her inside. "Well, you look like you have had a long journey. Come in, come in. We shall discuss terms once you have had something warm to eat." Elena felt a rush of gratitude so sudden and so powerful that it nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. She followed Charlotte inside, into a small but cozy common room where a fire crackled in the hearth, and for the first time since she had overheard those cruel words in the Duke's study, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, somewhere in this vast and unfamiliar city, she might find a place where she was wanted, rather than merely endured. She did not know, as she sat by that fire with a bowl of warm soup in her hands, that far behind her, in the great cold house she had left, a discovery was about to be made that would set into motion events neither she nor the Duke could yet imagine. She did not know that her quiet departure would echo through his household far louder than any argument ever could. She only knew, in that moment, that she had survived the first night of a new life, and that for now, that would have to be enough. The city outside the small inn continued its endless noise, carriages and voices blending into a steady hum, and Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. Tomorrow she would begin searching for work. Tomorrow she would start proving, to herself if no one else, that she was far more than a burden left behind. Tonight, she allowed herself simply to rest, wrapped in the fragile warmth of a stranger's kindness, and to dream, however cautiously, of a future built entirely on her own terms. Alexander Ashworth woke before dawn from a restless sleep. disturbed by dreams he could not quite remember, and found himself unable to fall back into slumber. He rose, dressed without calling for his valet, and made his way down to the study where he had spoken so carelessly the night before, hoping the quiet of the early hour might settle the strange unease sitting heavy in his chest. It was Edmund, the butler, who found him there, standing at the window with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands, and it was Edmund who delivered the news that would upend the fragile order of the household. "Your Grace," Edmund said, his voice careful, hesitant in a way that immediately caught Alexander's attention. "Miss Whitmore's room has been found empty. Her belongings are gone, save for a note left upon her bed." Alexander turned sharply, his tea forgotten. "Empty? What do you mean, empty?" "She appears to have departed sometime in the night, Your Grace. Grace found the room this morning, while bringing up the washing water. There was no sign of disturbance, only the note." Alexander felt something twist uncomfortably in his stomach, a sensation he could not immediately name. He strode past Edmund without another word, taking the stairs two at a time until he reached the small room at the top of the house that had belonged to Elena. The door stood open, the bed neatly made. The wardrobe doors left ajar to reveal nothing but empty hangers. On the pillow lay a folded piece of paper, and Alexander picked it up with hands that were not quite as steady as he wished them to be. The note was brief, written in Elena's careful, elegant hand. She thanked the Dowager Duchess for her kindness over the past 2 years, expressed her hope that the household would continue in good health, and wished everyone well. There was no anger in the words, no accusation, nothing that suggested she had heard anything at all. And somehow, that absence of blame felt far worse than any harsh word could have. Alexander stood in the small, bare room for a long moment, the note still in his hand, and told himself firmly that this was for the best. He had, after all, said as much himself only the night before. She was a responsibility he had not chosen, and now that responsibility had removed itself. He should feel nothing but relief. And yet he did not move from the room. He found himself studying the faded wallpaper, the small window overlooking the gardens, the indentation in the mattress where she must have slept for 2 years, and an unfamiliar heaviness settled over him that he could not easily dismiss. Word of Elena's departure reached the Dowager Duchess within the hour, and Margaret Ashworth descended upon her son with an expression of controlled fury that Alexander had rarely seen from his gentle, soft-spoken mother.
"What have you done?"
she demanded, standing in the doorway of the small room, her eyes moving from her son's face to the note still clutched in his hand. "I have done nothing, mother," Alexander replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "She chose to leave. That is her own decision." "Her own decision," Margaret repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Alexander, did you truly believe that girl would remain silent forever after hearing your words spoken so carelessly last night? Did you think the walls of this house could contain such cruelty without consequence?" Alexander felt a cold dread settle over him. "You believe she heard us?" "I do not believe it, Alexander. I know it. Grace mentioned to me only this morning that she found Elena distressed last night, shortly after our conversation in the study. The girl claimed she was merely tired, but Grace did not believe her, and neither, now, do I." Alexander said nothing, the weight of his mother's words pressing down upon him with an intensity he had not anticipated. He had spoken those words in a moment of frustration, tired after a long day of managing the estate's accounts, irritated by decisions he had not asked to make, and he had assumed, foolishly, that his private conversation with his mother would remain exactly that, private. She is a young woman, with no family, no fortune, and now, thanks to your careless tongue, no home, Margaret continued, her voice softening slightly, though the disappointment in her eyes remained sharp. "I do hope you understand the gravity of what you have done, Alexander. That girl has already lost everything once, and now you have shown her that even here, in the one place she had left, she was never truly welcome." Alexander lowered his gaze, unable to meet his mother's eyes, the note still clutched in his hand, as though it might somehow provide an answer to the growing discomfort spreading through his chest. He had built his reputation, quite deliberately, on cold efficiency and emotional distance, believing such qualities made him a stronger master of the estate, a man less vulnerable to the losses that had shaped his early years. His father had died when Alexander was barely 15, followed swiftly by an aunt who had raised him during his mother's long illness, and Alexander had learned, in the harshest possible way, that attachment led only to grief. Better, he had decided long ago, to keep everyone at a careful distance, to never allow himself to care too deeply for anyone who might one day be taken from him. But standing in Elena's empty room, staring at the note she had left behind with such quiet grace, despite the cruelty she must have overheard, Alexander felt the foundations of that careful distance beginning to crack. "I will send men to find her," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, "to ensure she is safe, at the very least." "And then what?" Margaret asked, folding her arms. "Will you drag her back to a house where she has been told, in no uncertain terms, that she is unwanted? Do you believe that is what she needs from you now, Alexander?" Alexander had no answer for that. He stood in silence, the morning light growing stronger through the small window, illuminating the empty room that had once, however briefly, belonged to a girl he had dismissed so easily, so carelessly, without ever truly considering what those words might cost her. Over the following days, Alexander threw himself into the management of the estate, with a fervor that his steward found almost alarming, reviewing accounts late into the night, inspecting tenant farms he had not visited in months, anything to keep his mind occupied, and away from the small, bare room at the top of the house that he now found himself avoiding entirely. His closest friend, Lord Percival Grant, visited the estate a week after Elena's departure, and immediately noticed the change in Alexander's demeanor. "You look as though you have not slept properly in days," Percival observed, settling into a chair across from Alexander in the study, the very room where the fateful words had been spoken. "Is something troubling you, Alexander?" "Nothing is troubling me," Alexander replied, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. Percival raised an eyebrow, but did not press the matter immediately. Instead, he allowed the conversation to drift toward lighter topics: the upcoming social season, recent developments in Parliament, the health of mutual acquaintances. But as the evening wore on, and the wine flowed more freely, Alexander found himself, almost against his will, recounting the events of the past week. "She left without a word of complaint," Alexander said, staring into the fire, rather than at his friend. "No anger, no accusation, simply a polite note of thanks and farewell. I have known her for 2 years, Percival, and I never once considered how she might have felt living in a house where she was so clearly seen as an obligation rather than a person." Percival listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "And now that she is gone, you find yourself thinking of her rather more than you expected." Alexander did not answer immediately, and his silence was answer enough. "You have always kept people at a distance, Alexander," Percival continued gently, "ever since your father's passing, and your aunt's illness that followed so closely after. I have watched you build walls around yourself for years, convincing yourself that distance was safety. But perhaps, in Miss Whitmore's case, you built those walls a little too high, and now you find yourself missing the very warmth you worked so hard to keep out." Alexander said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and Percival, wise enough to recognize when a point had struck true, did not press further that evening. In the weeks that followed, Alexander found his thoughts returning again and again to Elena, to small memories he had not realized he had retained. The way she had hummed softly while mending linens in the evening, the careful, patient manner in which she had read to his mother during her illness, never once complaining despite the long hours, the quiet dignity with which she had carried herself through a household that had, by his own admission, never made her feel truly welcome. He told himself, repeatedly, that this preoccupation would fade with time, that he had simply grown accustomed to her presence in the house and would soon adjust to her absence, just as he had adjusted to every other loss in his life. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks began to approach a month, Alexander found no such adjustment taking place. Instead, the hollow feeling in his chest only seemed to deepen, a quiet ache that followed him through the empty corridors of his own home, refusing to be dismissed or explained away. He did not yet understand what this feeling meant, or perhaps he understood it perfectly well and simply refused to name it, clinging instead to the familiar comfort of denial. But somewhere deep within him, a change had begun, slow and unwilling, like ice beginning to crack beneath a weight it could no longer bear. And though Alexander Ashworth would have vehemently denied it if asked, the cold, careful heart he had spent years protecting had already, without his permission, begun to thaw. A loud crash from the back room sent Elena Whitmore rushing from the front counter, her heart leaping into her throat, fearing the worst. She found young Lucy, her new apprentice, standing frozen beside a toppled shelf, bolts of fine silk scattered across the floor, one of them dangerously close to a knocked-over oil lamp that had, thankfully, gone out before it could catch anything alight. "I am so sorry, Miss Whitmore," Lucy stammered, her face pale with worry. I reached for the blue silk, and the whole shelf gave way. Elena knelt quickly, checking the fabric for damage, and more importantly, checking that no flame had touched anything. Relief flooded through her when she found the silk merely dusty, rather than ruined, and the lamp cold and harmless on the floor. "It is quite all right, Lucy. No harm done. Let us simply be more careful with how we stack the higher shelves in the future." It had been 6 months since Elena arrived in London, with nothing but a single traveling case and a heart full of quiet determination, and in that time, she had built something she was genuinely proud of. Charlotte Hale, the kind innkeeper who had taken her in that first night, had introduced her to several local families in need of a skilled seamstress, and word of Elena's talent had spread quickly through the modest but respectable neighborhood. Within 3 months, she had saved enough to rent a small shopfront of her own, a narrow but charming space with a bay window perfect for displaying her finest work, and she had hired Lucy, a bright-eyed girl of 16, with clever fingers and an eagerness to learn, as her first apprentice. The shop was modest compared to the grand establishments patronized by the wealthiest members of society, but it had begun to attract a steady and growing clientele, drawn by Elena's reputation for fine, careful stitching and her ability to create elegant designs at reasonable prices. She worked long hours, often late into the night, but for the first time since her parents' passing, Elena felt a genuine sense of purpose and pride in what she was building with her own 2 hands. As she helped Lucy restack the fallen bolts of fabric, the shop bell above the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Elena rose quickly, smoothing her apron, and turned to greet whoever had entered, only to find a woman of perhaps 40 years standing in the doorway, dressed in fine but understated clothing, her expression curious as she surveyed the small shop. "Good afternoon," Elena said warmly. "How may I assist you today?" "I have heard remarkable things about the seamstress on this street," the woman said, stepping further inside. "My name is Beatrice Wren, and I am told you have a gift for creating gowns that flatter even the most difficult figures. I confess I have struggled to find a dressmaker who understands my particular shape." Elena smiled, gesturing toward the small fitting area at the back of the shop. "I would be happy to help, Mrs. Wren. Every figure has its own particular beauty, and my work is simply to find the design that reveals it best." Over the following hour, Elena worked with careful precision, measuring, discussing fabric choices, and sketching several design options that would suit Beatrice's preferences and figure. Beatrice, delighted with the attention and skill Elena brought to the consultation, chatted freely as the fitting progressed, and Elena learned that her new client was the wife of a moderately wealthy merchant, well connected within certain circles of London society, though not quite among the highest ranks of the aristocracy. "You have a true gift, my dear," Beatrice said, as the fitting concluded, admiring the sketch Elena had produced. "I shall recommend you to every woman of my acquaintance who complains of ill-fitting gowns. Tell me, how did a seamstress of such evident skill come to open a shop in this particular neighborhood?" Elena hesitated only briefly before answering, choosing her words with care. "I previously lived in the countryside, working for a noble family. I decided to make my own way in the world, and London seemed the natural place to build something of my own." Beatrice studied her for a moment, curiosity evident in her expression, but she did not press further, sensing perhaps that there was more to the story than Elena wished to share. "Well, London's gain is certainly that family's loss," she said kindly, gathering her things. "I shall return in a fortnight for my fitting, and I shall bring my sister along as well. She has been searching for a new dressmaker for months." After Beatrice departed, Elena allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Word-of-mouth recommendations from clients like Beatrice Wren were exactly what her small business needed to grow, and she felt a warm glow of accomplishment settle over her as she returned to her work table to continue the day's tasks. That evening, After Lucy had gone home, and the shop had been carefully locked for the night, Elena walked the short distance back to the small set of rooms she now rented above a bakery, the warm smell of fresh bread greeting her as she climbed the narrow staircase. She had grown fond of this modest life, the simple rhythms of work and rest, the friendly faces of neighbors who greeted her by name, the quiet satisfaction of building something entirely her own. She thought, occasionally, of the estate she had left behind, of the Dowager Duchess whose kindness she still remembered fondly, of the cold words spoken by the Duke that had set her upon this new path. She did not regret her decision to leave, not for a single moment, though she sometimes wondered, in quiet moments before sleep, whether the household had noticed her absence at all, or whether life had simply continued there, without so much as a ripple. She had built a life here, in this small corner of London, a life that belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own hands and her own choices, rather than the charity or tolerance of others. And though the road had not been easy, though there had been nights of loneliness and days of exhausting labor, Elena found herself, more often than not, genuinely content. A few days later, as Elena worked at her counter, preparing an order for a local family, the shop bell chimed once more, and a young man entered, his coat well-tailored, though not extravagant, his expression friendly and open. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Cole, a bookseller who had recently opened a shop 2 streets over, and explained that he had heard of Elena's skill from Charlotte Hale herself. "I am in need of new curtains for my shop window," Nathaniel explained, glancing around at the neat displays of fabric and finished garments. "Something that will let in light, but keep out the worst of the dust from the street." Elena set about discussing options with him, and found herself enjoying his easy manner and genuine interest in her craft, a welcome contrast to the cold formality she had grown accustomed to in her previous life. Nathaniel returned several times over the following weeks, first to collect his finished curtains, and then simply to visit, bringing small gifts of books he thought she might enjoy, and Elena found herself looking forward to his visits with a warmth she had not expected. He never pressed her for details about her past, seeming content simply to know her as she was now, a skilled and independent businesswoman, building her own future, and Elena appreciated this restraint more than she could easily express. In Nathaniel's company, she felt none of the careful guardedness that had characterized her years at the estate, none of the constant awareness of her own precarious position as a tolerated guest rather than a valued member of a household. Here, in her own shop, surrounded by her own creations, she was simply Elena Whitmore, a woman of skill and determination who owed her success to no one but herself. As the months passed, Elena's business continued to grow, her reputation spreading through word of mouth among the merchant and professional families of her neighborhood, and though she remained careful with her finances, saving diligently against future uncertainties, she began to allow herself small pleasures, an occasional new book from Nathaniel's shop, a warm meal at a nearby tavern with Charlotte and Lucy, quiet evenings spent simply enjoying the life she had built. She did not know that far across the city, in circles far removed from her own modest neighborhood, whispers had begun to spread about the mysterious disappearance of a young woman from one of the county's most prominent households. Whispers that would eventually find their way into the ears of society's most notorious gossips, and from there, inevitably, back to the very man whose careless words had set this entire chain of events into motion. She did not know that her quiet, carefully built new life was about to intersect once more with the past she had worked so hard to leave behind. For now, she simply continued her work, stitching gowns and curtains and small alterations, with the same careful precision she brought to everything she did, building a future one careful stitch at a time, unaware of the storm that was quietly gathering on the horizon of her hard-won peace. The whispers reached Alexander Ashworth at the worst possible moment, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, during the height of the London social season, delivered with poorly disguised delight by Lady Diana Wren, a woman well known throughout society for her sharp tongue and sharper eye for scandal. "Tell me, Your Grace," Diana said, fanning herself languidly as she approached Alexander near the refreshment table. "Whatever became of that young cousin who lived under your roof for so many years? I have heard the most curious rumors that she vanished from your household in the middle of the night, without so much as a proper farewell to society." Alexander felt his jaw tighten, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, a skill honed through years of practice in exactly these sorts of social battlefields. Miss Whitmore chose to pursue her own path, Lady Diana. There is nothing curious about a young woman deciding to build an independent life. Of course, Diana said, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Though I confess, some have wondered whether her sudden departure had something to do with certain unkind words spoken within your household. Servants do talk, Your Grace, and word travels remarkably fast in this city. Alexander felt a cold unease settle over him, the same discomfort that had plagued him for months since Elena's departure, now sharpened by the realization that private words, spoken in what he had believed was the safety of his own study, had somehow found their way into the mouths of society's most notorious gossips. He excused himself from Diana's company as politely as he could manage, though his mind raced as he made his way toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Percival found him there a short while later, nursing a glass of wine he had no real interest in drinking, his expression distracted and troubled. "You look as though you have seen a ghost," Percival observed, settling beside his friend. "Lady Diana Wren has apparently taken an interest in Elena's departure," Alexander said, his voice low. "Rumors are circulating, Percival. People are beginning to whisper about the circumstances of her leaving." Percival's expression grew thoughtful. "That was perhaps inevitable, Alexander. Servants talk to other servants, and eventually, word finds its way into drawing rooms across the city. You cannot control gossip once it has begun to spread." "I am not concerned for my own reputation," Alexander said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this was entirely true. "I am concerned for hers. If society begins to whisper that she left under a cloud of scandal, it could damage whatever new life she has attempted to build for herself." Percival studied his friend with evident interest, noting the genuine concern in Alexander's voice, a concern that seemed to extend well beyond simple guilt over careless words spoken many months ago. "You have thought of little else these past months, have you? Even I have noticed the change in you, Alexander. You attend fewer social engagements, you spend long hours alone in your study, and when her name is mentioned, however briefly, you become entirely distracted from whatever conversation is at hand." Alexander did not immediately deny this observation, and his silence spoke volumes to his perceptive friend. "Have you considered," Percival continued carefully, "that your feelings toward Miss Whitmore may extend beyond mere guilt over an unfortunate remark?" "Do not be absurd," Alexander said, though the protest lacked conviction, even to his own ears. "I barely knew the woman. She lived in my household for 2 years, and I spoke perhaps 100 words to her in all that time. And yet you think of her constantly," Percival pointed out gently. "You have inquired, more than once, whether any of our mutual acquaintances have heard news of her whereabouts. You react with visible discomfort whenever her name arises in conversation. Alexander, I have known you since we were boys together, and I have never seen you display such consistent preoccupation with any person, let alone one you claim to barely know." Alexander opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it again, uncertain how to counter an observation that struck uncomfortably close to truths he had spent months refusing to acknowledge, even to himself. He thought of Elena constantly, it was true. He thought of her quiet dignity, her careful hands at needlework, the soft sound of her voice reading aloud to his mother during long evenings of illness. He thought of the note she had left behind, thanking his household for kindness he knew, deep down, she had rarely truly received. "Even if what you suggest were true," Alexander said finally, his voice quieter now, "what purpose would it serve to acknowledge such feelings? She left my household because of words I spoke, words that revealed exactly the sort of man I had allowed myself to become. Why would she ever wish to see me again, let alone entertain any warmer sentiment?" Percival regarded his friend with something approaching sympathy. "Perhaps that is a question you might only answer by finding her and asking directly, rather than continuing to torment yourself with speculation from a distance." Over the following weeks, Alexander found himself unable to fully dismiss his friend's counsel, though he resisted acting upon it directly, uncertain of what he might say, or how he might explain his sudden interest in a woman he had so carelessly dismissed. Instead, he found himself making discreet inquiries, first through his household staff, several of whom maintained connections with servants throughout the county, who might have heard news of Elena's whereabouts, and later, through business acquaintances in London, who moved in circles where a talented young seamstress might have found employment. It was through one such inquiry that Alexander learned, quite by chance, that a woman matching Elena's description had opened a small but increasingly well-regarded dressmaking business in a modest neighborhood south of the river, a business that had earned praise from several respectable merchant families for its quality and craftsmanship. Alexander received this information with a strange mixture of relief and renewed unease. Relief that Elena had found a measure of stability and success. Unease at the realization of just how thoroughly she had rebuilt her life without any assistance from him. He did not immediately act upon this knowledge, uncertain of what right he had to intrude upon a life she had built so carefully in his absence. Instead, he found himself, almost despite his own intentions, quietly ensuring that certain business connections and merchant families of his acquaintance might find their way to her shop. Discreet recommendations passed along through intermediaries who had no idea of the personal history behind such seemingly casual suggestions. His mother, observing her son's continued preoccupation over the following weeks, finally addressed the matter directly one evening, as they sat together after dinner, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "You have changed since Elena left us, Alexander," Margaret said quietly, watching her son's face carefully. "I have watched you become more thoughtful, more attentive to the feelings of those around you, more willing to consider the consequences of careless words before they leave your mouth. Whatever her departure cost her, it seems to have taught you a lesson you badly needed to learn." Alexander said nothing, staring into the fire, his mother's words settling over him with quiet weight. "I do hope," Margaret continued gently, "that should the opportunity ever arise for you to see her again, you will not allow pride or fear to prevent you from speaking honestly about whatever it is you now feel. Life has already shown both of you how quickly circumstances can change, how easily people we care for can be lost. Do not waste further time in silence, Alexander, when honesty might yet mend what careless words once broke." Alexander considered his mother's counsel long into the night, long after she had retired and the fire had burned down to embers, and found himself, for the first time since Elena's departure, allowing himself to fully acknowledge the depth of feeling that had grown within him during her absence, feeling that had transformed slowly from simple guilt into something far more complex, far more difficult to ignore. He did not yet know when or how he might see her again, but he resolved, sitting alone in the quiet study where his careless words had first set these events into motion, that when the opportunity arose, he would not allow pride or fear to hold him silent as he once had. The cold, careful heart he had spent years protecting had thawed far more than he had ever intended to allow, and Alexander Ashworth found, somewhat to his own astonishment, that he no longer wished to fight against that change. The grand ballroom of Lord Arthur Finch's townhouse blazed with candlelight, hundreds of flames reflected in tall mirrors and polished crystal, as London's most fashionable families gathered for the annual charity gala benefiting the city's orphaned children. Elena Whitmore stood near the edge of the room, feeling distinctly out of place among the silks and jewels of society's elite, though Beatrice Wren, who had insisted on bringing her along as a guest rather than merely her dressmaker, remained firmly at her side. "You designed half the gowns in this room, my dear," Beatrice had insisted when Elena protested the invitation. "It is only right that you should see your own creations in their proper setting, and perhaps gain a few new clients in the process." Elena had reluctantly agreed, and now found herself wearing one of her own designs. A deep emerald gown that complemented her dark hair and fair complexion, feeling simultaneously proud of her craftsmanship and anxious about her unfamiliar surroundings. She had built a comfortable, independent life over the past year, but moments like this, surrounded by the wealth and status she had once brushed against so briefly during her time at the estate, still filled her with a lingering unease she could not quite shake. She was examining a particularly elaborate gown worn by a young debutante across the room, mentally noting the construction of its intricate sleeves, when a sudden hush seemed to ripple through a portion of the crowd near the entrance. Elena glanced up, curious, and felt her entire body go still as she recognized the tall, dark-haired figure who had just entered the ballroom. Alexander Ashworth moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command and respect, his expression polite but reserved as he greeted various acquaintances, and Elena felt her heart begin to pound with a mixture of shock, apprehension, and something else entirely, something she refused to name even to herself. She considered, briefly, retreating to a quieter corner of the ballroom, or perhaps departing entirely. But Beatrice, oblivious to the sudden tension gripping her companion, had already begun steering her toward a group of acquaintances gathered near the refreshment table, a group that, Elena realized with growing alarm, was drawing steadily closer to where Alexander himself now stood. There was no graceful way to avoid the encounter, and within moments, Elena found herself standing barely 3 feet from the man whose careless words had once driven her from the only home she had known, the man she had spent countless quiet evenings trying not to think about, and utterly failing. Alexander's eyes found hers across the small gathering, and Elena watched, with a strange, detached fascination, as his carefully composed expression flickered, just briefly, with something that looked remarkably like shock, followed swiftly by an emotion far harder to name. "Miss Whitmore," Alexander said, his voice carefully measured, though Elena, who had spent 2 years learning to read the subtle variations in his tone, detected an unfamiliar unsteadiness beneath his composed exterior. "I had not expected to see you here this evening." "Your Grace," Elena replied, her own voice cool and perfectly polite, drawing upon every ounce of composure she had developed over the past year of building her independent business. "It seems London is smaller than either of us might have expected." An awkward silence settled over the small group, several of Beatrice's acquaintances glancing between Elena and the Duke with poorly disguised curiosity. Clearly sensing an undercurrent of history neither party seemed inclined to explain. "You are looking well," Alexander said finally, and Elena noted, with some satisfaction, the genuine sincerity in his tone. "I understand you have established a successful business here in London." "I have," Elena confirmed, keeping her tone carefully neutral. "I find independent work suits me rather better than I might once have expected." Alexander's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly at this comment, and Elena, watching him closely despite her determination to remain unaffected, saw something flicker across his face that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. "Miss Whitmore," Alexander said, lowering his voice slightly, clearly attempting to create some measure of privacy within the crowded room, "I wonder if I might have a brief word with you, in private, regarding matters from your time in my household." Elena felt her composure waver slightly at this request, torn between a desire to simply refuse and walk away, and a curiosity that had lingered stubbornly throughout her months of independence, a quiet wish to understand why he had spoken as he had, and what, if anything, he now felt about her sudden departure. "I do not believe there is anything remaining to discuss, Your Grace," Elena said finally, choosing caution over curiosity, unwilling to expose herself to further hurt from a man who had already caused her more pain than she cared to admit. "My time in your household has concluded, and I have built a new life for myself since then. I see little purpose in revisiting the past." Alexander's jaw tightened, and Elena watched him absorb her rejection with visible effort, though he did not press the matter further in front of the surrounding company. "Of course," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I understand entirely. Forgive me for the intrusion." He excused himself shortly afterward, moving away through the crowded ballroom, and Elena, watching his retreating figure, felt an unwelcome pang of something that might have been regret, mixing uncomfortably with her carefully maintained composure. Beatrice, once the small group had dispersed, turned to Elena with poorly concealed curiosity. "My dear, I had no idea you were previously acquainted with the Duke of Ashworth. However did that come about?" Elena forced a smile, deflecting the question as gracefully as she could manage. "It is a long story, and not one I care to dwell upon this evening. Shall we examine the refreshments? I believe I saw an excellent selection of pastries near the far window." Beatrice, sensing her friend's discomfort, allowed the subject to drop, though Elena noticed several curious glances directed her way throughout the remainder of the evening, whispered conversations that undoubtedly speculated about the nature of her connection to one of London's most notoriously reserved noblemen. Elena spent the remainder of the gala attempting to focus on her original purpose, admiring the gowns of various attendees, exchanging pleasant conversation with several potential new clients that Beatrice introduced her to. But her thoughts kept returning, despite her best efforts, to the brief encounter with Alexander, to the genuine remorse she had glimpsed beneath his carefully composed exterior, to the strange, unwelcome flutter of feeling that his presence had stirred within her, feeling she had believed, quite firmly, she had left behind along with her previous life. As the evening drew to a close and Elena prepared to depart with Beatrice, she caught one final glimpse of Alexander, across the emptying ballroom, standing near a tall window, his expression distant and troubled as he stared out into the darkness beyond the glass. For just a moment, their eyes met once more across the distance, and Elena felt something pass between them that she could not easily name, something that suggested this brief and uncomfortable reunion was far from the last time their paths would cross. She turned away first, gathering her composure as she followed Beatrice toward the exit, telling herself firmly that whatever lingering feelings the encounter had stirred within her, she would not allow them to undermine the independent life she had worked so hard to build. She had left the Duke's household because she refused to remain where she was, merely tolerated rather than valued, and she resolved, as she stepped out into the cool night air, that she would not allow a single evening's chance encounter to weaken that resolve, however unsettling the feelings it had stirred within her. But as her carriage rolled away from Lord Finch's townhouse, carrying her back toward the modest neighborhood she now called home, Elena found herself unable to fully dismiss the image of Alexander's troubled expression, or the quiet, unwelcome hope that had flickered, however briefly, at the sight of genuine remorse in his eyes. Edmund the butler exchanged a worried glance with the housekeeper as Alexander Ashworth passed through the entrance hall for the third time that morning, his expression distracted, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, a folded letter clutched absently in one hand that he seemed to have forgotten he was carrying. "His Grace has not been himself since the charity gala," the housekeeper murmured to Edmund once Alexander had disappeared into his study. "He barely touches his meals. He has cancelled 3 social engagements this week alone, and Henry tells me he found him in the stables past midnight 2 nights ago, simply standing with the horses as though he could not sleep." Edmund nodded gravely, having observed similar troubling changes in his employer's behavior over recent weeks. "I believe it concerns Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I overheard him mention her name to Lord Percival during his last visit, and his tone suggested considerable distress." Inside the study, Alexander sat at his desk, the letter in his hand forgotten entirely as his thoughts returned, as they had so often over recent weeks, to the brief and painful encounter at Lord Finch's gala. Elena's cool composure, her polite but firm rejection of his attempt at conversation, had struck him with far greater force than he had anticipated, forcing him to confront, fully and completely, the depth of feeling he had spent months trying to deny even to himself. Percival arrived that afternoon, summoned by an uncharacteristically urgent message from Alexander, and found his friend in a state of visible agitation, pacing the length of his study rather than settling into his usual composed manner. "I saw her, Percival," Alexander said without preamble, before his friend had even fully seated himself. "At Lord Finch's gala. She looked well, truly well, independent, and confident, in a way I had never witnessed during her time in this household." "And how did the encounter proceed?" Percival asked, though something in Alexander's expression suggested the answer would not be a happy one. "Poorly," Alexander admitted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration, entirely unlike his usual composed self. "I asked if we might speak privately, and she refused, quite firmly, stating that she saw little purpose in revisiting the past. And she was entirely justified in that refusal. Percival, what right do I have to expect her forgiveness, or even her patience, after the words I spoke, words that drove her from her home and forced her to rebuild her entire life from nothing?" Percival regarded his friend thoughtfully. "You have clearly given this a great deal of consideration." "I have thought of little else," Alexander said, sinking finally into a chair across from his friend. "I find myself unable to focus on estate business, unable to sleep properly, unable to engage in even the simplest social conversation without my thoughts drifting back to her. I believe, Percival, that I have fallen in love with a woman I wronged so terribly that she has every reason to despise me." Percival's eyebrows rose slightly at this direct admission, the first time Alexander had spoken so plainly about the nature of his feelings. "That is a significant admission, Alexander. What do you intend to do about it?" "I do not know," Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with genuine uncertainty. "She has made her feelings toward further contact with me quite clear. I have no right to intrude upon the life she has built, particularly if my presence brings her nothing but discomfort or painful memories." And yet, Percival said carefully, you have already made several discreet inquiries about her business, arranged for potential clients to discover her shop, and now find yourself unable to think of anything else. Do you believe, truly, that simply retreating into silence will resolve these feelings, Alexander, or will it simply prolong your own suffering while denying yourself any chance at genuine happiness? Alexander considered this question for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled softly in the hearth, the same fire that had witnessed his careless words nearly a year earlier, words that had set into motion everything that followed. What would you have me do? Alexander asked finally, his voice quiet. I would have you demonstrate, through consistent and genuine action rather than mere words, that you have truly changed, Percival said. Words alone will mean little to a woman who has already heard how easily cruel words can leave your lips. But actions, Alexander, consistent kindness and respect demonstrated over time, without expectation of reward, those might eventually earn you the chance to speak honestly about your feelings, should she ever prove willing to listen. Alexander absorbed his friend's counsel with careful consideration, recognizing the wisdom in Percival's words, even as he struggled with uncertainty about how exactly to proceed. Over the following weeks, he began quietly expanding his efforts to support Elena's business, always through indirect means that would not intrude upon her clearly stated wish for distance, ensuring that respectable families of his acquaintance learned of her exceptional skill, that her shop received favorable mention in the sort of social circles that might bring steady, reliable business. He also began, gradually, to change other aspects of his behavior, aspects that had nothing directly to do with Elena, but that reflected a genuine shift in how he approached his relationships with others. He spent more time with his tenants, listening more carefully to their concerns rather than simply issuing instructions. He treated his household staff with greater warmth and consideration, remembering birthdays and family events that he had previously overlooked entirely. He apologized, with evident sincerity, to his mother for the years of emotional distance he had maintained since his father's passing, acknowledging that his careful walls of protection had cost him more than they had ever protected him from. Margaret, observing these changes with quiet satisfaction, mentioned them approvingly during one of their evening conversations. You have become a different man these past months, Alexander. I only hope Elena, wherever she is, might one day witness this change for herself and understand that her departure, however painful, was not entirely without its purpose. I hope for that as well, Alexander admitted quietly, though I fear I may never have the opportunity to demonstrate this change to her directly, given her clear wish to maintain distance from our past acquaintance. Patience, Alexander, Margaret advised gently. Genuine change reveals itself in time, through consistency rather than grand gestures. Should the opportunity ever arise again, ensure that your actions speak more clearly than any words you might offer. Alexander took this counsel to heart, continuing his quiet efforts to support Elena's business and demonstrate his genuine transformation to those around him, though he made no further attempt at direct contact, respecting, however painfully, her clearly stated wish for distance. He did not know whether these efforts would ever reach her attention, or whether they would matter at all if they did, but he found, somewhat to his own surprise, a measure of peace in simply doing what he believed to be right, regardless of whether it earned him any reward. Percival, observing his friend's continued efforts over the following weeks, felt a growing confidence that Alexander's transformation, unlike so many temporary resolutions born of guilt or momentary regret, represented something genuine and lasting, a fundamental shift in the man his oldest friend had become. You have changed a great deal these past months, Alexander, Percival observed one evening as they shared a quiet drink together in the study. Whatever comes of your feelings toward Miss Whitmore, I believe this transformation has made you a better man, regardless of the outcome. Alexander nodded slowly, staring into the fire with an expression that had grown steadily more thoughtful and less guarded over recent months. Perhaps that is the truest lesson in all of this, Percival. That genuine change must come first from within, regardless of whether it ever earns forgiveness or reward from those we have wronged. I only hope, in time, that Elena might witness enough of this change to believe it genuine, should our paths ever cross again, in circumstances more favorable than our last encounter. Neither man could know, as they sat together in comfortable silence that evening, just how soon that opportunity would arise, or the dangerous circumstances that would ultimately bring Alexander and Elena back into each other's lives. The morning began with an unwelcome shock when Elena arrived at her shop to find the front window shattered, glass scattered across the display of carefully arranged fabrics, and a note pinned crudely to the doorframe warning her, in poorly disguised threatening language, to close her business or face further consequences. Lucy, arriving shortly after, gasped in horror at the destruction, and within the hour, Elena had learned from a sympathetic neighbor exactly who was likely responsible. Vincent Hale, owner of a larger, more established dressmaking establishment 2 streets over, had grown increasingly resentful of the steady stream of clients Elena's shop had drawn away from his own business over recent months. He had made no secret of his displeasure at social gatherings, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen that an upstart seamstress with no proper training or family connections had no right to compete with established businesses like his own. He came by just yesterday evening, the neighbor, an elderly widow named Grace Bell who ran the bakery beneath Elena's rooms, explained with evident concern. I heard him shouting something about ruining your reputation if you did not close your doors within the month. I did not think much of it at the time, thinking it merely the bluster of an angry man, but clearly I was mistaken. Elena felt a cold knot of anxiety settle in her stomach as she surveyed the damage to her shop, the broken glass, the ruined bolts of fabric that had been displayed in the window, the crude threat pinned to her door. She had built this business from nothing, through months of exhausting labor and careful saving, and the thought that it might be destroyed by nothing more than another merchant's jealousy filled her with a fury she had rarely experienced. We must report this to the authorities immediately, Charlotte insisted when she arrived, alerted by Lucy's frantic message, her expression grim as she examined the damage alongside Elena. This cannot be allowed to continue unchecked. Elena agreed, and together they filed a report with the local constable, though the officer's response proved frustratingly non-committal, suggesting that without direct witnesses to the vandalism itself, little could be done beyond noting the incident for their records. Over the following days, the harassment continued in smaller, more insidious ways. Several regular clients received anonymous letters warning them against continued patronage of Elena's shop, suggesting vague but troubling rumors about the quality of her work and the propriety of her business practices. A shipment of fine silk that Elena had ordered for an important commission mysteriously failed to arrive, and upon investigation, she discovered that the supplier had received a competing offer from Vincent Hale that had apparently redirected the order entirely. Elena found herself growing increasingly desperate as the threats to her livelihood mounted, her careful savings dwindling as she scrambled to replace lost materials and reassure worried clients. Her confidence in the future she had built beginning to waver for the first time since she had arrived in London with nothing but a single traveling case and quiet determination. It was during this period of mounting crisis that Elena received an unexpected visit from Beatrice Wren, who arrived at the shop with an expression of considerable curiosity and a piece of information that would upend Elena's understanding of recent months entirely. "My dear, I must ask you something rather delicate," Beatrice said once they had settled in the small back room of the shop, away from Lucy's curious ears. "Have you been aware that the Duke of Ashworth has been quietly recommending your services to numerous families of his acquaintance over these past several months?" Elena felt her breath catch, genuine shock flooding through her at this revelation. "I was not aware of any such thing. Are you quite certain, Beatrice?" "Entirely certain," Beatrice confirmed. "My husband mentioned it only last week, having heard directly from a business associate that the Duke had personally recommended your shop to at least a dozen respectable families over recent months, always through discreet, indirect means, never claiming credit for the recommendation himself. Given the tension I observed between the two of you at Lord Finch's gala, I confess I found this information rather surprising, and thought you deserved to know of it." Elena sat in stunned silence for several moments, her mind racing to reconcile this new information with everything she had believed about Alexander's feelings toward her. She thought of the careless words that had driven her from his household, the cold formality that had characterized their brief acquaintance, and found it genuinely difficult to understand why a man who had once called her nothing more than an unwanted burden would now quietly work to support her success without any apparent expectation of acknowledgement or reward. "I do not understand," Elena admitted finally, her voice uncertain. Why would he do such a thing, particularly after everything that passed between us? Perhaps, Beatrice suggested gently, the Duke has come to regret his previous treatment of you, rather more deeply than either of us initially realized. Guilt alone might explain a single gesture, but sustained, discreet support over many months, offered without any attempt to claim credit or seek acknowledgement, suggests something considerably deeper than mere guilt, my dear. Elena did not know how to respond to this suggestion, her emotions a confused tangle of lingering resentment over past hurt, genuine confusion about Alexander's apparent change of heart, and something else entirely, something she still refused to fully acknowledge even to herself, a fragile, unwelcome hope that perhaps the cold man who had once dismissed her so easily had genuinely transformed into someone capable of true care and consideration. Her confusion only deepened over the following days as the harassment from Vincent Hale continued to escalate, culminating in a particularly alarming incident when Elena discovered, upon opening her shop one morning, that someone had attempted to force entry through the back door during the night, apparently intending to steal or destroy her remaining stock of fine materials before being frightened away, likely by Grace Bell's dog barking loudly from the bakery below. Shaken and increasingly desperate, Elena confided in Charlotte about the mounting crisis threatening to destroy everything she had built, uncertain how much longer her business could survive Vincent Hale's escalating campaign of intimidation. You must seek help, my dear, Charlotte insisted firmly. This has gone well beyond simple business rivalry. Someone attempted to break into your shop in the middle of the night. This is a matter for more serious intervention than the local constable seems willing to provide. Elena knew Charlotte was right, but she felt paralyzed by uncertainty, unwilling to appeal to Alexander for assistance, despite his apparent quiet support of her business, unwilling to reopen a chapter of her life she had worked so hard to move beyond, yet increasingly aware that she lacked the resources or connections necessary to properly protect herself and her small business from Vincent Hale's determined campaign of destruction. It was this precarious situation, teetering between pride and practical necessity, that would soon bring Alexander Ashworth back into her life, in circumstances far more dramatic and urgent than either of them could have anticipated. Circumstances that would finally force both of them to confront the true depth of feeling that had grown, quietly and against both their wishes, in the months since Elena's departure from the Ashworth estate. Smoke curled beneath the back door of Elena's shop just past midnight, and it was only the sharp bark of Grace Bell's dog, followed swiftly by Grace herself pounding urgently on Elena's door, that saved the building from complete destruction. Elena woke with a start, the acrid smell already reaching her small rooms above the bakery, and rushed downstairs in her nightclothes to find flames licking at a pile of oil-soaked rags someone had clearly placed deliberately against the rear entrance of her shop. "Fire! Fire!" Grace shouted, already working alongside several neighbors who had emerged from nearby buildings, forming a hurried chain to pass buckets of water from the street pump toward the burning building. Elena joined them immediately, her heart hammering with terror at the thought of losing everything she had built, throwing bucket after bucket of water onto the flames alongside her neighbors until, after several terrifying minutes, the fire was finally extinguished, leaving the back door and a portion of the rear wall scorched, but the shop itself largely intact. Word of the fire spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by dawn, a small crowd had gathered to survey the damage and offer sympathy, though Elena, exhausted and shaking from the ordeal, could think only of Vincent Hale's escalating campaign against her, a campaign that had now clearly crossed into genuinely dangerous territory. It was into this scene of smoke and chaos that Alexander Ashworth arrived, having received an urgent message from Beatrice Wren, who had heard of the fire through her husband's business connections and immediately recognized the danger Elena now faced. Alexander had ridden through the night without pause, arriving just as the morning light began to illuminate the full extent of the damage, and he dismounted his horse quickly, pushing through the gathered crowd with an urgency that drew curious glances from onlookers. "Elena," he called, spotting her standing near the scorched rear entrance, soot streaking her face, her nightclothes still damp from the frantic effort to extinguish the flames. Elena turned at the sound of his voice, and despite the exhaustion and fear of the past hours, felt a complicated rush of emotion at the sight of him, relief mixing uncomfortably with lingering resentment and confusion over his mysterious support of her business. "Your Grace," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion, "this is hardly the moment for social calls. I came the moment I heard, Alexander said, ignoring her cool tone entirely, his eyes moving over her with evident concern, taking in the soot on her face, the exhaustion in her posture. Are you injured? Is anyone hurt? No one is injured, Elena confirmed, some of her guardedness softening slightly at the genuine worry in his voice. Though my shop has suffered considerable damage, and I have little doubt regarding who is responsible. Vincent Hale, Alexander said, his expression darkening. I have heard rumors of his harassment campaign against your business over recent weeks. I should have acted sooner. Elena's guardedness returned in full force at these words. You knew of this? And yet you said nothing to me directly? I did not wish to intrude upon your clearly stated wish for distance, Alexander explained, his voice earnest, despite the exhaustion evident in his own features, suggesting he too had traveled through much of the night without rest. I have spent months attempting to support your business quietly, without claiming any credit or seeking any acknowledgement, precisely because I believed direct contact would only cause you further distress. I see now that this restraint may have cost you dearly, and for that, I am truly sorry. Elena stared at him for a long moment, torn between anger at his continued interference in her life without her knowledge, and a growing recognition that his intentions, however clumsily executed, had genuinely stemmed from care, rather than mere guilt or obligation. Come, let us move away from this ruined doorway, Alexander said gently, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the small yard behind the shop, away from the curious eyes of gathered neighbors. Elena, too exhausted to protest further, allowed him to guide her a short distance away, and once they stood in relative privacy, Alexander turned to face her directly, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever witnessed during her years in his household. Elena, he said, using her given name without title for the first time since her departure, I have wanted to speak with you properly since that evening at Lord Finch's gala, though I respected your wish for distance and did not press the matter further. But I can no longer remain silent while your safety and livelihood are so clearly threatened, nor can I continue pretending that my feelings toward you are anything less than what they truly are. Elena felt her heart begin to race, uncertain whether from lingering exhaustion, fear from the night's events, or the weight of Alexander's evident sincerity. And what exactly are your feelings, Your Grace? I have come to care for you deeply, Alexander said, the words emerging with visible difficulty, as though he had rehearsed this moment many times, yet still found the actual speaking of it profoundly challenging. The words I spoke, the night you overheard my conversation with my mother, were born of my own fear of caring too deeply for someone I might eventually lose, just as I lost my father, just as I nearly lost my mother during her long illness. I convinced myself that distance and coldness offered protection from such loss, and in doing so, I caused you tremendous pain through careless cruelty you did nothing whatsoever to deserve. Elena listened in silence, her expression carefully guarded despite the evident emotion in Alexander's voice, unwilling to allow herself to be swayed too easily by words alone, however sincere they might sound in this moment of crisis and exhaustion. I understand, Alexander continued, that words alone mean little after everything I have already said and done. I do not expect immediate forgiveness, nor do I expect you to simply set aside the pain I caused, because I now claim to have changed. But I am asking, Elena, for the opportunity to demonstrate that change through my actions, beginning with ensuring that Vincent Hale faces proper consequences for his campaign against your business, and continuing however long it might take to earn back even a measure of your trust. Elena felt tears threatening despite her exhaustion and determination to remain composed, the weight of months of confusion, hurt, and reluctant hope finally overwhelming her careful defenses. You cannot simply appear after months of silence and expect an apology, however sincere, to undo the pain of feeling like nothing more than an unwanted burden in the only home I had left. I know, Alexander said quietly. I am not asking you to forget that pain, Elena, nor to pretend it did not happen. I am only asking for the chance to prove, through consistent action rather than empty words, that I have genuinely changed, and that whatever feelings have grown within me these past months are real, regardless of whether you ever choose to return them. Elena studied his face for a long moment, taking in the genuine exhaustion and vulnerability evident in his expression, so different from the cold, composed nobleman she had known during her years in his household. She did not trust herself to speak further in this moment, her emotions too raw and confused, following the terror of the fire and the shock of his sudden, earnest confession. "I cannot give you an answer now, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "My shop has been damaged, my livelihood threatened, and I have far more pressing concerns at present than untangling feelings I do not yet fully understand myself." "Of course," Alexander said, though disappointment flickered briefly across his features before he composed himself once more. "Allow me, at the very least, to assist with addressing Vincent Hale's campaign against you, and with repairing the damage to your shop. Whatever you decide regarding my feelings, you deserve to feel safe in your own business, and I intend to ensure that safety, regardless of your ultimate answer." Elena, too exhausted to argue further, and recognizing the practical necessity of addressing Vincent Hale's dangerous campaign before it could escalate further, reluctantly agreed to accept his assistance in resolving the immediate crisis, though she made clear, in no uncertain terms, that this practical cooperation implied nothing about her feelings regarding his earlier confession. As dawn fully broke over the damaged shop, Alexander began issuing quiet but decisive instructions, summoning his own solicitor to formally investigate Vincent Hale's campaign of harassment, arranging for skilled tradesmen to begin immediate repairs to the scorched rear wall and shattered window, and ensuring, through his own considerable influence, that Vincent Hale would soon find himself facing consequences far more serious than he had likely anticipated when he first began his campaign against Elena's modest but hard-won success. Elena watched him work with quiet, decisive efficiency, recognizing in his actions a genuine determination to make amends that went well beyond mere words, and though she remained guarded, uncertain what to make of the complicated tangle of emotions his return to her life had stirred within her, she found herself, despite every effort to remain composed and unaffected, unable to fully suppress the fragile, unwelcome hope that perhaps, against all her expectations, Alexander Ashworth had truly changed into a man capable of genuine care and consideration. Vincent Hale's shop stood eerily quiet 3 weeks after the fire, its windows dark, a formal notice from the local magistrate posted upon its door, and Elena, passing by on her way to deliver a finished commission, felt a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief at how swiftly the entire matter had been resolved once Alexander's solicitor had begun investigating the campaign of harassment against her business. It had taken less than a fortnight for Alexander's solicitor to gather sufficient evidence linking Vincent Hale directly to the fire, the shattered window, and the intimidating letters sent to Elena's clients. Evidence that included a servant willing to testify against his former employer, once assured of protection from retaliation, and a supplier who confirmed receiving payment from Hale in exchange for redirecting Elena's silk shipment. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the very real possibility of criminal prosecution, Vincent Hale had quietly closed his shop and departed London entirely, his reputation destroyed among the very merchant families he had once served. Throughout this process, Alexander had remained a steady, reassuring presence, never overstepping the careful boundaries Elena had established, never pressing for answers regarding his earlier confession, simply continuing to demonstrate, through consistent action, the genuine change he claimed to have undergone. He had personally overseen the repairs to her shop, ensuring the finest craftsmen completed the work quickly and to the highest standard, though he had insisted, despite Elena's initial protests, on covering the costs himself, framing the gesture not as charity, but as rightful compensation for the danger his own past carelessness had indirectly contributed toward. "You bear no responsibility for Vincent Hale's actions," Elena had protested when he first proposed covering the repair costs. "Perhaps not directly," Alexander had acknowledged, "but had I acted sooner to address the rumors and dangers threatening you, rather than maintaining careful distance out of my own uncertainty and fear, this crisis might have been resolved before it ever reached such dangerous proportions. Allow me this small measure of amends, Elena," without argument. Elena had eventually relented, recognizing the genuine sincerity behind his insistence, and over the following weeks, found herself growing gradually more comfortable in Alexander's presence, as he continued to visit her shop regularly, always with legitimate reason, checking on the progress of repairs, discussing the ongoing legal proceedings against Vincent Hale, occasionally simply inquiring after her well-being, with a warmth and genuine interest that felt entirely different from the cold formality she remembered from her years in his household. Lucy, observing these regular visits with poorly concealed curiosity, finally broached the subject directly one afternoon, as she and Elena worked together on a particularly delicate embroidery commission. "The Duke visits rather often, Miss Whitmore. Might I ask what exactly exists between the two of you?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering, uncertain herself how best to characterize the complicated, evolving relationship that had developed between herself and Alexander over recent weeks. "We share a complicated history, Lucy. He once spoke words that caused me tremendous pain, and though he has since demonstrated genuine remorse and considerable kindness, I find myself still uncertain how fully to trust this apparent change in his character. He certainly seems different from how the other maids described him when you first arrived in London," Lucy observed thoughtfully. "Grace mentioned once that you had lived in his household before coming here, and that something unpleasant occurred that drove you away. Yet he now appears here so regularly, always with such evident concern for your well-being." Elena did not elaborate further, though Lucy's observation echoed her own growing recognition that Alexander's behavior over recent weeks bore little resemblance to the cold, distant nobleman who had once dismissed her so carelessly. He listened attentively when she spoke, remembered small details from previous conversations, and consistently demonstrated respect for her independence and hard-won success, rather than any attempt to diminish or take credit for what she had built entirely through her own efforts. One afternoon, as Elena worked alone in her shop while Lucy ran an errand, Alexander arrived carrying a small, carefully wrapped package, his expression uncharacteristically nervous as he presented it to her. "What is this?" Elena asked, accepting the package with evident curiosity. "A small gift," Alexander explained, "though I hope you will not mistake it for an attempt to purchase your forgiveness or affection. I simply saw it and thought of you." Elena unwrapped the package carefully to find a beautifully bound book of poetry, its cover embossed with delicate silver detailing, clearly a volume of considerable value and craftsmanship. "I remembered," Alexander continued, watching her reaction carefully, "that you once mentioned, during a quiet evening reading to my mother, a particular fondness for the works of this poet. I confess, I had nearly forgotten the conversation myself, until I encountered this volume in a bookshop, and the memory returned to me quite suddenly." Elena felt genuinely moved by this gesture, touched not merely by the gift itself, but by the evident care and attention behind it, the recognition that Alexander had remembered a small, seemingly insignificant detail from years earlier, a detail she had assumed had passed entirely unnoticed during her time in his household. "Thank you," she said softly, genuine warmth entering her voice for the first time since their reunion. "This is truly thoughtful, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "Please, Elena, if we are to move forward from the past, however slowly, I would ask that you call me by my given name, as you once did during quieter moments in my mother's company." Elena hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Alexander, then." Over the following weeks, their relationship continued to deepen gradually, built not upon grand romantic gestures, but upon the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, genuine conversation, and mutual respect. Alexander began accompanying Elena to social gatherings where her business connections required her presence, standing quietly by her side, never overshadowing her own achievements, simply offering steady support and genuine pride in her accomplishments. When rival merchants occasionally attempted to question the propriety of her independent business ventures, Alexander spoke firmly in her defense, though always careful to frame such defense around Elena's genuine skill and hard work, rather than his own noble status or influence. Margaret, the Dowager Duchess, learning of the growing connection between her son and Elena through Alexander's own increasingly candid letters, expressed her genuine delight, writing to Elena directly to express her happiness at their reconciliation and her hope that Elena might one day consider visiting the estate once more, though entirely on her own terms and timeline. Elena found herself, gradually and against her own earlier determination, to maintain careful distance, allowing herself to trust in the genuine transformation Alexander had undergone, recognizing in his consistent, patient actions over these many weeks a sincerity that words alone could never have conveyed. She still carried the memory of that painful night when she had overheard herself described as an unwanted burden, but she found that memory growing steadily less sharp, tempered by the genuine warmth and respect Alexander now consistently demonstrated. One evening, as they walked together along the river, following a pleasant dinner at Charlotte's Inn, Alexander turned to Elena with an expression of quiet vulnerability she had grown increasingly familiar with over recent weeks. "I do not wish to press you for any answer before you feel genuinely ready," he said softly. "But I find myself needing to tell you, Elena, that my feelings for you have only grown stronger throughout these recent weeks, rather than fading as perhaps a passing infatuation might. I love you, truly and completely, and I hope, in time, you might come to believe that the man standing before you now bears little resemblance to the careless, frightened nobleman who once caused you such pain." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they stemmed not from pain or fear, but from a complicated mixture of genuine happiness and lingering caution, the natural hesitation of a heart once badly wounded, now being offered a chance at healing. "I believe you, Alexander," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I believe that you have truly changed, and I find that my own feelings toward you have grown as well, despite every effort I made to guard against exactly this outcome." Alexander's expression lit with genuine joy at these words, though he did not press further in that moment, seeming to understand instinctively that Elena needed time to fully process this mutual acknowledgement before any further steps might be taken. They continued their walk along the river in comfortable, hopeful silence, both aware that something significant had shifted between them, yet both content, for now, to simply allow that shift to settle naturally, without rushing toward conclusions that deserved careful, patient consideration. Snow fell softly outside the tall windows of the Ashworth estate, as Elena stood before a mirror in what had once been her small servant's room, now transformed into an elegant guest chamber, befitting her new status as a woman Alexander had publicly and repeatedly acknowledged as the woman he intended to marry. She smoothed the deep blue gown she herself had designed for this particular evening, a winter ball hosted by Alexander at his own estate, the very house she had once fled in the darkness of night, believing herself unwanted and unwelcome. Margaret entered the room quietly, her expression warm as she observed Elena's careful preparations. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear. Alexander will hardly be able to contain himself when he sees you this evening." Elena smiled, though a flicker of nervous anticipation remained evident in her expression. "I confess I feel rather overwhelmed, returning to this house under such different circumstances than when I first left it." "That is entirely understandable," Margaret said gently, taking Elena's hands in her own. "But you should know, Elena, that this house has never truly felt like home since your departure. Alexander's transformation these past months has been remarkable to witness, and I have no doubt whatsoever that his feelings toward you are genuine and lasting. Whatever happens this evening, know that you are welcomed here now not as an obligation or burden, but as someone genuinely cherished." Elena felt tears threatening at these words, though she carefully composed herself, unwilling to disturb the careful arrangement of her appearance before the evening's festivities began. Margaret squeezed her hands once more before departing to attend to her own preparations, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off the freshly fallen snow beyond her window. Downstairs, the ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, evergreen boughs draped elegantly along the walls, hundreds of candles casting warm light across gathered guests, drawn from throughout London society. Many of them, the very families who had once whispered curious rumors about Elena's mysterious departure from this same household nearly 2 years earlier. Now those same families gathered to witness what promised to be one of the season's most anticipated announcements. Alexander stood near the grand staircase, his expression a careful mixture of composed dignity and barely contained anticipation, greeting arriving guests while his eyes repeatedly drifted toward the staircase, watching for the moment Elena would finally descend to join the gathering. Percival, standing nearby with a knowing smile, leaned toward his friend with quiet amusement. "You appear rather more nervous than I have ever witnessed you during any prior social engagement, Alexander. This evening carries rather more significance than any prior engagement," Alexander admitted, his gaze still fixed upon the staircase. When Elena finally appeared at the top of the stairs, a hush rippled through the assembled crowd, whispered conversations pausing, as guests turned to observe the woman, whose mysterious history with the Duke had provided fodder for society's gossip for nearly 2 years. Elena descended the staircase with quiet grace and dignity, her deep blue gown catching the candlelight beautifully, and Alexander moved immediately to meet her at the base of the stairs, offering his arm with an expression of such evident pride and affection that even the most skeptical observers among the gathered guests could no longer doubt the genuine nature of his feelings. "You look absolutely magnificent," Alexander murmured, as Elena took his offered arm, her hands steady, despite the many curious eyes now following their every movement. "Thank you," Elena replied softly, "though I confess, I feel rather like the entire room is holding its breath, waiting for something significant to occur." "Perhaps they are," Alexander said, his expression growing more serious, "for I do intend, this very evening, to make a significant announcement, should you feel ready and willing to receive it." Elena's heart began to race, understanding immediately the significance behind his words, though she found herself, despite months of growing trust and affection, still surprised by the depth of emotion that flooded through her at this moment. As the evening progressed, Alexander guided Elena through the gathered crowd, introducing her not with the careful evasiveness that had characterized their previous public appearances, but with open, evident pride, acknowledging directly and without hesitation her skill as a businesswoman, her courage in building an independent life, and the genuine respect and admiration he held for everything she had accomplished. Several guests who had once whispered unkind rumors about her mysterious departure now found themselves genuinely charmed by her warmth and evident intelligence, their earlier skepticism gradually transforming into sincere admiration. Near midnight, as the orchestra paused between dances and servants began circulating with glasses of champagne for a customary toast, Alexander requested a moment of the assembled guests' attention, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet ballroom. "I wish to share something with all of you gathered here this evening," Alexander began, his hand finding Elena's as he spoke, his eyes never leaving her face despite addressing the wider crowd. "Nearly 2 years ago, I spoke careless, cruel words about a woman who had done nothing but demonstrate kindness, skill, and quiet dignity throughout her time in my household. Those words drove her from this house, and rightfully so, for I had failed entirely to recognize her true worth, blinded by my own fear of caring too deeply for anyone I might one day lose." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, many guests exchanging glances as they recognized the significance of this public acknowledgement, so different from the careful discretion that had characterized Alexander's reputation throughout the years they had known him. "In the time since her departure," Alexander continued, "Elena Whitmore has built an independent and thriving business entirely through her own skill and determination, requiring assistance from no one, least of all myself. She has demonstrated a strength of character and genuine kindness that I failed to properly appreciate during her years in this household, and I count myself profoundly fortunate that she has allowed me the opportunity, however undeserved, to demonstrate genuine change and earn back even a measure of her trust and affection." Alexander turned fully to face Elena now, releasing her hand only to reach into his coat and produce a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a beautiful ring, its design elegant yet understated, clearly chosen with careful thought rather than mere ostentatious display. "Elena," he said, his voice steady, despite the evident emotion behind his words, "I love you completely, not for your beauty or your grace, though you possess both in abundance, but for your strength, your independence, your unwavering integrity, even in the face of genuine hardship. I am asking you, before all these witnesses, whether you might consider becoming my wife, not out of any obligation or charity, but because I believe genuinely that we might build a life together, founded upon mutual respect, honesty, and love." Elena felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, no longer able to maintain the careful composure she had held throughout the evening, overwhelmed by the depth of sincerity in Alexander's words and the genuine transformation he had demonstrated throughout the many months since their painful history had first begun. "Yes," she said softly, then more firmly, as the words seemed to catch in the sudden hush of the crowded ballroom. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as Alexander slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, his expression one of pure, unguarded joy, entirely unlike the carefully composed dignity he had maintained throughout years of careful emotional distance. Margaret, watching from nearby with tears of her own gathering in her eyes, embraced them both warmly, while Percival raised his glass in a hearty toast to the couple's future happiness. As the orchestra resumed playing, and guests began offering their congratulations, Elena found herself surrounded by warmth and genuine celebration, standing in the very house she had once fled believing herself unwanted, now embraced fully as the woman who had earned, through her own strength and grace, the genuine love of a man who had finally learned that true worth could never be measured by convenience or obligation, but only by the depth of character revealed through both hardship and triumph. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Alexander drew Elena briefly aside, to a quiet corner, near the same tall windows, where he had once stood alone, troubled and uncertain, watching her depart from Lord Finch's gala many months earlier. "I once called you a burden I never asked to carry," Alexander said softly, taking both her hands in his own. "I was wrong, Elena. More wrong than I have been about anything else in my entire life. You are not a burden, and never were. You are the greatest gift I have ever received, one I very nearly lost through my own foolish pride and fear." Elena smiled through fresh tears, squeezing his hands warmly. "And I once believed I would never find a place where I was truly wanted, rather than merely tolerated. I am grateful, more than words can properly express, that we both found our way back to each other, and that your heart, once so carefully guarded against genuine feeling, finally found the courage to burn with love, rather than remain frozen in fear." Outside, snow continued falling softly over the estate grounds, blanketing the gardens and pathways in pristine white, while inside, warmth and joy filled the grand ballroom, where two people, once separated by careless cruelty and painful misunderstanding, now stood united by genuine love, mutual respect, and the hard-won knowledge that true happiness required not merely fortunate circumstance, but the courage to change, to forgive, and to trust fully in the possibility of love, even after the deepest of wounds.